So it is my great pleasure to introduce the session on assessing the performance of international forest governance. We're very fortunate to have with us an excellent panel of speakers who together hold many decades of relevant experience in the field. Each speaker is going to approach this topic in a different way, with a different analytical lens, and I think provide a very interesting diversity of perspectives. This invites all of us to consider how the ways in which we define the meaning and aims of international forest governance shape our ideas of how it performs and what might constitute success, or if that's even the right question. So as we know, IFG is highly complex and it's contested. Over the last 40 or so years, we've seen a proliferation of forest-related initiatives. This includes intergovernmental processes addressing biodiversity, climate, trade and tropical timber, to private and civil society initiatives such as sustainability certification, to grassroots efforts of all descriptions. So a major catalyst for many actors involved has been stopping tropical deforestation. But even such a seemingly singular and physical goal is legitimated by discourses that address more fundamental end goals or values, like why do we want to stop tropical deforestation? Well, there are values such as conserving biodiversity, respecting local community and indigenous rights, decolonizing, promoting democracy and good governance, etc. So when we assess the progress or performance of IFG, we can focus on a single physical target like zero deforestation, or we can assess according to the underlying goals that legitimate the target. We can also assess individual initiatives like REDD+ or the EU Flag T, or we can examine their interactions. Or, as we'll hear from the speakers today, we can focus on the broader diffusion and remaking of rules and norms within and across world regions and social groups. When we do that, it raises lots of interesting questions around how power is exercised for what purpose and for whose benefit. So as we listen to the different insights of the speakers, we might want to consider if it's possible for conflicting findings about performance to be simultaneously correct. And if so, what are the lessons that researchers, policymakers, activists, or practitioners can draw from this complexity? And how can they apply these lessons in practical or impactful ways? So with all of this in mind, I'd now like to introduce the speakers. I'm starting first with Professor Bas Arts, who holds a personal chair in forest governance at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University. He is also chief scientist at PBL Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, where he advises the Dutch government on environmental policy. His research and teaching focuses on international forest, biodiversity, and climate change governance, local natural resource management, and their interconnections. Following Bas will be Professor Lucas Giesen, who is based at TU Dresden in Germany, where he's professor of tropical and international forestry and director of the Institute of International Forestry and Forest Products. Before that, he worked as the principal scientist for forest governance at EFI and has held positions at the universities of Wageningen and Göttingen. Our final speaker, Professor Maria Brockhaus, is chair of international forest policy at the University of Helsinki. Before that, she was a senior social scientist at CIFOR, where she led the policy component in CIFOR's global comparative study on REDD+. Maria is particularly interested in policy networks, discursive practices, and the political economy of deforestation in the global South. So now, finally, before I hand the mic over to Bas, I want to mention a few matters of procedure. So we have planned it so that each speaker has about 10 minutes to provide their first reflections. Please hold raising your hand or hold thinking about questions necessarily until after all three have spoken, because we think this will allow maximum time for discussion afterwards. But meanwhile, of course, feel free to pose questions in the chat or then raise your hand once they're finished. We should have lots of time for discussion at the end. Also, just a note to think about it, please, when you can, keep your questions relatively brief so that we can give lots of people opportunity to speak. So now, Bas, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Well, thank you, Connie, for this interesting and lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen, first of all. I hope that it will. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's an honor for me to start this very interesting table, performance of international forest governance. And I have a bit of a provoking title, I think. So international forest policy, a non-regime that nonetheless performs. If you look into the academic literature about international forest policy, you will find many different interpretations of this very interesting phenomenon. And many of these conceptualizations are particularly related to regime theory, which is a particular body of research in international relations literature. And a regime can be considered in international institutions, so a set of values, norms, rules, and procedures through which actors, being it states, governments, or international organizations, govern a certain issue area in international politics, including forest, but it can also be human rights or trade or whatever international topic of relevance. And most scholars on regimes deem it crucial to have a so-called hardcore regime to make it relevant and performative. And thinking about a hardcore, they are talking about legally binding treaties. So sometimes it's also referred to as a treaty regime. And a legally binding treaty made it relevant because it makes parties to a treaty to comply because it's legally binding to all kind of rules, norms, values, and procedures. But such a hardcore legally binding treaty is lacking with regard to forest. So we don't see an international forest treaty regime, but something else, and how to call it then. An alternative is the so-called regime complex terminology. And here it's said that indeed, if you look at forest-focused international rules, these are all voluntary, so non-legally binding. But forests relate to many other topics, be it biodiversity, trade, human rights, sustainability, biodiversity, etc. And in these issue areas, you do find legally binding instruments. So on the one hand, if you look at the forest regime complex, part of it is forest focused, which is voluntary, non-legally binding, and another part of it is forest related. And some of those elements are indeed legally binding. Okay, if you then look at all these different interpretations of international forest policy, they also have, as an implication in my view, they have different perspectives in terms of evaluating that, that international forest policy in terms of performance and effectiveness. And one example, scholars on non-regime often see it as a symbolic regime. So symbolic norms that do not have any effect on the ground or are not even intended to have an effect on the ground, because most governments or interest groups don't have an interest in having a real legally binding forest treaty. So, but still there are problems, so they just design symbolic norms which are not meant to have any effect. To some extent, these conclusions are opposite to what we also find in the empirical literature. You do find impact assessments of forest governance initiatives that do have positive impacts on the ground. So that made me wonder whether so much focusing on regimes as the theoretical perspective really helps us further in understanding what's happening in international forest policy. So I, and together with colleagues, come up with a different perspective, which we call the global local nexus. And maybe you have heard the presentation of my colleague Jelle Behagel on Wednesday. He was also referring to the global local nexus, and there are more scholars. And if you compare this perspective with regime theory, I think it does three things. First of all, it shifts from a vertical to a horizontal perspective, because in regime theory, the assumption is you have some kind of international institutions at the top that trickles down to national and local levels at lower levels. So a horizontal perspective. This is a vertical perspective, and this is a horizontal perspective, which is of course inspired by network theory and also by practice theory. Secondly, it shifts from an intergovernmental to an interorganizational and transnational focus. So going beyond going beyond governments and also including NGOs and business actors. And this is inspired from pluralism in political theory. And third, it goes beyond rules and institutions. It also includes discourses, norms, and resources. And this is very much inspired by the framework of Cashier and Bernstein on a domestic pathway of influence. And all these elements, ideas, discourses, norms, rules, resources, these travel through these global local networks. Well, the next question, of course, is if you look at from this perspective, what do you say then about the performance of international forest policy? And of course, first of all, I have to say a few words about methodology. First of all, performance is defined as local environment, economic and or social impacts of globally induced forest governance interventions. And if we have that perspective of these global local networks and this definition of performance, of course, we are talking about complex causality. It's not about, let's say, attributing an effect to one treaty, which might be possible in a treaty regime with a very simple kind of a target and timetable, but not in terms of this very complex global local nexus. So it's about the contribution of many factors. And then, of course, you have to say something in terms of methodology and data collection, data analysis at three levels, so to speak. The global, the local, and about the nexus, to link those. And at the global level, it's about content and data set analysis of initiatives. At the local level, it's about local impact assessments. I used our several systematic literature reviews who bring together, synthesize these local impact assessments. And of course, you need a reliable narrative to link the local to the global and the other way around. Well, let's move quick to some empirics. In my latest work, I analyzed 4 cases, FLAG-T, RED+, certification, and participatory forest management. And I'm quite sure that all of you, at least most of you, do know a lot about these cases. But again, what we try to do is to get a sense of the performance of these 4 initiatives. And where does the evidence come from? What are these sources? First of all, various global data sets, for example, from FEO, C4, FSC, PEFC, and also IFRI. The work includes 5 systematic literature reviews with more than 200 local impact assessments, both on the environment and socioeconomic effects. And altogether, they represent more than 20 million hectares of forest around the world. Yes, this is quite substantial, but I think it's not sufficient yet to be generalized to the whole world. And thirdly, also many case studies were used in this work, both from my own group and other groups, and also some synthesis of case studies through QCA analysis. Having said that, this is then what comes out of it at a very aggregate level. And yeah, I can only be very short about it now, but maybe during the discussion, we can go into depth. With these 4 initiatives together, they reach about 1.4 billion hectares worldwide, which is about 1/3 of the forest worldwide. And if you look into the systematic literature reviews, then about half of the impact assessment report also a positive effect, which actually is much more than I had expected myself. But there are a few buts. So on the one hand, you could say, indeed, all these initiatives, somehow they perform, at least the glass is half full and half empty. But of course, we are talking in many cases about small wins. So hardly ever, for example, a community becomes very wealthy due to a PFM project. Of course, there are also trade-offs. So particularly between environment on the one hand and socioeconomic benefits on the other. So it's not always win-wins. That's what's often on paper in sustainability literature, but you find many trade-offs on the ground. Secondly, the second but is the counterfactual. Should these impacts also have occurred without these global governance initiatives? And I'm quite sure, and this is empirically, not just my opinion, that both the reach and the impacts would have been less without these initiatives at a global level. And of course, what about the other half? Because it's the glass is half full, half empty. And yes, many projects fail. Some even worsen the situation in terms of illegal logging or deforestation. Of course, you'll find elite capture, you find corruption, asymmetric power relations, all is there. But I decided to foreground, at least in my presentation today and also in my latest book, let's say the more positive developments, the more progress, because all the negative things, which are rightly so already reported in the media, in the social media, in many papers and articles. And I'm also a bit concerned that we become too pessimistic, too cynical, and maybe even too depressed. And that's something which I don't think is a very good thing. Having said that, I now hand over to Lucas, and we'll stop sharing.
Lucas, you're still muted. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Connie, if I may.
Sure. Yes. So each speaker, feel free to just start your slides when the previous one is done.
So do you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Oh, excuse me.
It worked very well in the practice run, but
Yes, yes.
Here we go. Okay, we're good.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bas. And I will give you, with a similar structure of my presentation, a notion of our main findings from our research program on international forest governance, a selective one, which I titled The Two Phases of International Forest Governance, and putting it provocatively, that those two phases come into being through customizations by powerful actors. So what was the overall aims of this research program? It was describing at global and international level the institutional key characteristics of what we call the international forest regime complex, but also explaining those characteristics. It was secondly describing some of the domestic political consequences, and not so much the biophysical consequences, as Bas was already walking us into a little bit, but more the political consequences of selected institutional elements of this regime complex, but also then to explain them, those consequences, looking at powerful actors with a particular focus or bias, you may consider, on bureaucratic actors. If we look to our overall methodological approach, which I'm detailing in a forthcoming book, then I have to say, I used to call it analytical explanatory approach, but I fear I have to even call it a little bit agnostic, because when Bas says somebody reports positive effects, I'm asking myself, please define positive for who? So in this way, I'm taking a little bit of an agnostic approach, combining theories and methodologies from international relations and policy analysis. What we've done, and I was very surprised to see this being cited in this conference, because I thought nobody read that paper, is what we call a from below approach. So not only following this top-down view of United Nations coming from somewhere in New York, somewhere into the world down, but looking up from people's perspectives, local people perspectives, but also national perspectives, looking up to higher or more global or more international echelons of that regime. And we take a very actor-centered approach, not really following a clear ism like like those grand theories, but being more close towards a rational neorealist account than to maybe institutional or discursive or critical institutionalist account. Our design draws on political ethnography with a number of qualitative case studies, but, and here the word interpretative now might be read differently than back in the 1970s, which tries to explain case phenomena based on previously defined variables. And we were drawing on a research group model in which a senior scientist, and that was myself back then, as a group leader, provides theoretical guidance with then culturally, language-wise, and network-wise acquainted young researchers and colleagues from different countries go for their own analysis under this supervision to receive deep field access to documents, to people, to information, and also to informal aspects of this international forest governance, which I find, and you will see this in my conclusions, largely being overlooked in a lot of research. And using multiple triangulations, but this you can really read then in that book. What are our key findings? And in a nutshell, I put them into this one slide. We are seeing two phases of international forest governance. At least that's my interpretation, that if you are inside, in practical terms, if you're inside this international fora, into this international domain and sphere, working for internationally active organizations or fora, you might rather take this multilateral view on things and see this international phase. However, by multiple downstream customizations and amendments and adaptations on that vast stretch from global norms all the way down to local trees, we do observe a large number of specific customizations, we call them. And I'm borrowing this from Eva Thoman, this terminology from her EU policy research, and adapting this to global norms in this forest regime complex. So looking from this multilateral international phase, we observe an exceptional high degree of institutional fragmentation between a number of global, but even a larger number of regional and bilateral cooperation regimes on forests, all of which are only seemingly synergistic, hiding behind empty formulas such as sustainability or sustainable forest management, but in reality, often showing gold conflicts and conflicts between different policy instruments. But we also find that this fragmentation is highly useful for some specific actors and policy sectors, most notably state actors who can manage this large degree of fragmentation, who can travel many locations over long periods of time with their budgets, and non-state actors might not be capable, and especially for the forestry sector under this business as usual non-interference, non-hard regulation regime. So we observe this regime complex as mainly being a menu, like in a restaurant, a menu for actors to choose from. And some of those, and thus here, I might now give in a little bit on my previous notion of non-regime, that yes, of course, from this menu to choose from, some elements, some initiatives do de facto deliver some effects. Others don't at all. And I think this selection process of actors to choose from has a lot to do with which actors choose, which actors have the capabilities of bringing things on the ground and which don't. On the case of UNFF, and this is where I'm reducing now my non-regime claim or hypothesis, our study on this UNFF definitely shows us that it's even getting less than a non-regime, starting from Dimitrov, minus political attention, minus finance, and minus the climate attention, leading me to that still conclusion. And we find, together with colleagues also in this room, and I also hope that Carmen and Anna and Georg and so forth are with us, we found that how matter strong the focus is on non-state, community-based NGO and so on, that state-led elements in this regime still matter a lot, especially in paving the way for more industry-driven follow-up initiatives. Now going into these domestic phases, asking ourselves then, we have one regime complex, but we have up to 200 or 100 something multiple domestic phases of that very regime in different domestic contexts. Because selected regimes can readily be made relevant. And one of the most remarkable aspects here was the Convention on Desertification, on defending UNCCD, being made relevant in Indonesia in areas where desertification was certainly not an issue. We also observe competition for authority between private and state actors and governance institutions. And we observe that in bilateral forest cooperation and development cooperation regimes, responsible state bureaucracies are oftentimes circumvented for the benefit of NGO cooperation. What we should not ignore is national power structures, and they are absolutely decisive in how those domestic phases are being shaped. However, they often remain invisible, empirically invisible for international actors and also for analysts, I would argue. And we got some small mosaic pieces looking behind the scenes to conclude this. Maybe to come to some main theoretical conclusions of this research program, and then in the discussion, I will be happy to discuss more on my take of performance and effects. So we do observe these two phases, right? And it could lead us to the conclusion that with those two phases, we even look at two different study objects. This now goes far beyond the scope of this presentation, but just to spur some critical thinking. Conceptually, when drawing on this regime language, and Bas rightly criticized this or showed the limitations, I would argue that we should distinguish between regime structures and their policies. The first being more stable, written in stone almost, and the others very much adaptable. Also under COVID, things adapted. We do provide an extended regime definition, which also leads too far here, but which gives an institutionalist, but also a realist account of things. And we have to learn that these regimes are not just implemented or to be implemented or to be transposed, but they are customized. So in explaining regimes, and especially their effects and performance, I think we need to go beyond formal aspects urgently. We need to look into informal institutions, informal rules, informal policy goals, informal goals of regimes, those goals which are not written down, but everybody agrees, or a lot of people agree. The informal interests of powerful actors and also informal power sources. So my last point here would be that from my research, I would also conclude that we might have a sovereignty issue here. Well, I stay analytical. I'm not complaining about this, but especially in bilateral cooperation regimes, we see that global North countries can easily circumvent global South state infrastructure, state institutions, with big project money incline on the sovereignty of global South states, and by circumventing then the responsible state actors and privileging NGOs for their development cooperation work, really posing sovereignty questions for those global South countries. In case I'm able to share my presentation, the key publications from which you can draw this will be provided, but this is up to the organizers if this is possible to be shared or not. With this, Connie, thank you very much, and I'm handing over.
Thank you. Maria.
So hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And I do hope you can see this presentation now in presentation mode. Can you?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Wonderful. So thanks to Connie, to Bas, and Luca's talks, what I will try to do now, also maybe to fulfill some of the expectations that Connie, you were putting out there for us and creating a bit, I would like to draw our attention maybe away a bit from the regime towards those that are actually governed. And perhaps also in my talk, I would like to talk a little bit about those that are researching these regimes and those that are actually governed by international forest governance, or in my case study where I draw upon related to international forest and climate change governance. So, and to start my talk, maybe I would like, and that goes back to the question of performance, where I would like to start. I love this picture here. I always use it in the background because it completely depends whom you ask. You will get very different answers to what is portrayed here. For some, this is environmental destruction. For some, this is a social disaster. For others, this is development. This is rural development. And yes, there are many ways of interpreting this. But to be clear also about what performance I'm talking based on the case studies in this forest and climate change policy arena and that I'm using here for this talk, what I'm talking about is a business as usual that is very much defined as an unsustainable and unjust status quo, where we have a situation where this business as usual reinforces unbalanced power structures, supporting basically, or these power structures that actually support or favor large-scale business interests, driving unsustainable practices and facilitating state capture. So my interpretation for this talk of what we see in the background, I could have taken many different pictures as well, is a current business as usual, a situation of forest frontiers all over the world in our current time, which I call here, relying on Woolford and others, a Plantationocene time, where we have a business as usual that's unsustainable and unjust. Just to be very clear about that. And where also, for the rest of my talk, where I define this transformational change, TC, as a just transition that breaks up pre-existing power structures, reducing power imbalances and empowering actors that support sustainability. So performance outcomes of global forest governance, of global forest and climate change governance should be, for the purpose of this talk here, should be measured basically to the extent these initiatives, this forest and climate change governance delivers actually the desired change, this transformational change that would be a just transition. And again, status quo is actually what we see, and we could use as an expression of that deforestation rates of primary forests. We could use, if you want to have it more European rather than always global south, even though that's what I'm talking about, we could use biodiversity measurements in Finnish or Swedish forests. We could use gender participation. That was the topic that came up in one of the earlier conference talks, etc., etc. So many expressions of what is unsustainable and unjust, and many indicators for that as well. What would change then is defined as a positive desired change would be a just transition. So the proposal I want to make, and that's maybe at the core of my talk here, is that if we want to study this, and now I'm turning basically from those that are governed through these governance regimes also to those that study, so us basically, that study forest governance, I would like to make a proposal for a normative evaluative stance. So I would argue that to research transformations, to research transformational change, what is required is a critical review of discursive practices, basically, incentive structures and power relations, as basically the three main areas where shifts have to happen to deliver transformational change. And that's here the proposal, what I would argue for us as researchers is what is required is really a normative and evaluative stance, where positioning then draws attention to inequalities embedded in these unbalanced power relations. So whenever we talk about performance, I would argue we have to be very explicit with our own positioning, where a stance is taken that recognizes the political nature of socioeconomic relationships and that also puts ethical considerations at center stage. And maybe the note I would like to put here, which is valid, by the way, for all 3 points, is that, of course, there are tensions between sustainability and justice. And as we all know from the literature, that's one big part of the challenge for transformational change, how to navigate sustainability and equity tensions, actually. I'm spending a lot of time here, but that is because I would like to really flag or to argue that I think such a stance would help us to make very conscious decisions when we research and try to understand and unpack global forest governance. That such a stance would help us to make very conscious decisions over the choice of what and how we study climate governance, forest frontiers, forest governance, and maybe most importantly, perhaps that we are very explicit in our analysis about for whom we actually study and raise these questions. So, and for whom is perhaps also a question then in the analysis for, and that goes back to my beginning, who is actually governed here to the benefit of whom and for whom. And I think I'm already beyond my time here, but just to give you a little bit an example, or at least an example of how we have applied that, I'm referring here to a paper that we published last year. When I say we, I'm talking here about a larger group of colleagues with whom I have worked for the past 2 decades, basically together in forest and climate change mitigation and adaptation research. Grace Wong, Pam Tutui, Maura Mulyono, Heria Judy, Monica Di Gregorio, and myself. And we basically analyzed our different case studies that were related to REDD+, to an Asian forestry, social forestry project where we looked at development, forestry, climate policy intersections, then adaptation in Mali in West Africa, as well as adaptation, mitigation, and development and related synergies or integration. And we had a wide range of methods, maybe very close to what Lucas called for, a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods and analysis was applied in these case studies. And what we did was, by taking this stance I was explaining earlier, we really went through all of our cases and tried to understand and to unpack. Sorry, even my own presentation is trying to push me faster through it. What we kind of tried to pull out were exactly with these explicit normative evaluative stands were the findings that we came up with in this comparative analysis across all of these cases was really that we saw institutional path dependencies that enabled actually a continuation of established North-South power relations, where also national elites were reinforcing the structure or exploiting. We had climate action that was actually absorbed, if not even lost, within development priorities in favor of commodity crops for global markets, often accompanied by techno fixes in all the case studies that we had. And these techno fixes, and that makes it so interesting, is they are always framed as expressions of a modernity. And this is also reflected in the discourses, in the narratives that we kind of unpacked within these different case studies, where very often you have then mitigation that matters, so forest-based mitigation that matters more than forest-based adaptation, when cash crops are favored for global needs rather than local adaptive livelihoods or mobility strategies, which very much matter in relation also to global forest restoration initiatives, and which are very often suddenly dismissed as simply backwards or environmentally destructive. We heard yesterday Alizé Wild's talk. This is a very old narrative that was central to the early colonial narratives in legitimizing also then claims over forest lands in the global south, in colonies, and to justify a colonial approach. So coming to an end, basically across the cases, the local and the political seems to disappear over time. Forest climate governance in forest frontiers still rendered technical, and none of that, I guess, is surprising here. Bas, you already pointed to ending on cynical notes or maybe being even depressive. And actually, with my talk, I don't want to be, and I don't want to make anybody depressed at all. But maybe actually what I want to express here also with this explicit call for positioning yourself when we and ourselves when we do research is actually, I still really think we need to be radical. We shouldn't be depressed by all of this, but we should be maybe very sober, analyzing that performance, global forest governance is not performing the way one could hope for. And we could translate that, rather than sinking into depression, into more radical ways of studying global forest governance. That echoes a bit this decolonization call that I think, Connie, you had mentioned at the beginning. But really, don't get depressed, but maybe get radical would be the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maria. That was a very excellent, provocative end to the discussion here. And thanks to all of the speakers. I think that was a wonderful diversity of perspectives and a lot of really valuable insights and plenty of things. Yes, lots of clapping. Hope you can appreciate the virtual clapping. Yes, I will clap out loud. So that was really, really excellent. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and hearing from the audience. So please do feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to say something. Or ask a question, and let's try to be relatively brief with our questions so that we can allow everyone to have a chance to talk. So as people are formulating their questions, I can start with one, and also I'm sure as a panel, I imagine you have questions for each other too. So I'm not worried about having enough to talk about. One thing, I mean, following on what Maria said, I mean, this whole premise of international governance is an interesting one. I think there has been maybe a strong, and the world researchers in this. So there's been a strong focus on, the global will, what has been decided in some manner at a higher level. And we can also play with the words global and international as well. But, and that what the objective is that should be then possibly, happening and being translated maybe accurately, whatever that is, on the ground. And so we're looking at this sort of one-way trajectory of influence. But, is that how we should be looking at this? Or how, is there another way of looking at sort of a more two-way or a multi-way process of deciding what our goals are? Because if we're, for example, trying to look at power distribution, et cetera, is it appropriate for, a set of actors sitting wherever in the world, usually in the global north, to decide and dictate what should be happening everywhere else? So I don't know if each of you have something you might like to comment on about that, because it's sort of a fundamental issue around, what is the role of international governance? Bas, or were you raising your hand? Or
yeah, I did. Yeah, very shortly, this global local nexus idea is indeed meant to be both ways. So if you, for example, if you talk about this participatory forest management, is also partially based on local movements and regional and global movements from indigenous people and local communities to work on bottom-up approaches. But definitely there are power asymmetries involved in this local global nexus, but at least as a perspective, it is, and it should be both ways.
Thanks, Bas. Just to, yeah, and Lucas, but just to follow up briefly on that. So does that create a challenge though? Because if the actual framing of the norms is both ways, then how does one assess, what is performance, right? Because, you don't start necessarily with the international idea of what performance is. It might be influenced by the local, but then how do we assess performance? If we think that, maybe what is decided at the international level should rightly be changed or should practically be changed when it's implemented.
Yeah, maybe shortly again. What I did is looking at those local impact assessments on these initiatives, particularly on certification and participatory forest management. And of course, I think Lucas also asked me what are positive impacts, but you look at benefits for forest and people, which are of course defined by these assessors at the local level. And for forests, often these are ecologists and they use the ecological indicators. But if you look at the social economic ones, often it's also in interaction with the people themselves. So they co-define what the benefits are. But of course, I think the critical perspective on these discourses, what positive impacts are, or what development is, and that's particularly what Maria was referring to, that remains very important. But I think if you yeah, and the other thing is that if you use so many different impact assessments, they all have their own way of evaluating. So you are indeed mixing things up. But yes, we need to be critical on defining what is performance from both perspectives, the global and the local.
Great, thanks, Bas. Yeah, so Lucas had his hand up, and then Maria.
Yes, thank you. And Bas, really thank you also for provoking me to think into these performance things. I think it's one fundamental issue is important to clarify if we are talking among scientists and other types of researchers, is that whether we are talking on normative grounds or whether we talk on analytical grounds. And I'm relatively sure, Bas, those ecologists who go in the field, measure with their indicators, they don't write in their impact reports something good is happening. They are writing nitrogen levels going up, or butterflies going down, or this species or that carbon stock increasing or decreasing. So in the social sciences, I think we should make very fundamentally clear and explicit, and this is what I appreciated about Maria's presentation very much, very explicit about the normative stances that she sees as being necessary in order to arrive at certain ends, or whether we stay or remain or restrain ourselves to analytics only. And I'm using, with my students, I'm using Karl Marx as a, well, for me at least, a good example of an back then excellent philosopher and maybe even analytical social scientist of the early times and early hours, explaining with his theory of capital and production means and so forth, a lot of back then early industrialized society things happening. And based on these analytics, then grounding him and others some very far-reaching normative theories of Marxism, if you so wish. And I appreciate that we now in our presentations keep this apart. And my challenge to Bas would simply be, say, positive what? I can more deal with less butterflies or more snakes or these indicators. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucas. I mean, just to follow up on that, I mean, having been involved in, for example, quite a few certification assessments, I'm not sure ecologists perform in exactly that way. I'm not sure they don't have opinions. And along those lines, Maria, I wonder if you have comments you might make on what Lucas just said too, about whether we can be non-normative in our research. Is that, is that a possibility?
I was very surprised. I would challenge, of course, I would challenge that we would be able, I don't think you can oppose analytical and normative. I don't think that flies, because even in these examples you just gave, of course, there are norms at play. There are choices that have been made over the indicators that have been chosen. There are norms at play and beliefs at play. What is counted? There are structures and embedded beliefs and norms at play. Who has the right to count? Who is heard? So basically, as my friend Arnold and I keep saying, who counts, what it matters, who counts, who defines what is counted, the counter matters. So there are norms everywhere. And to me, it's a bit absurd even, I guess, but maybe I understand where you are coming from, but to disentangle norms, a normative approach from an analytical approach is really opposite exactly of what I tried to say, and that is, let's be explicit about and make an effort really also as scientists, also as part of decolonizing our worldviews. And decolonizing is not always a global north-south thing, but it's also very much happening here in our polarized world, understanding and positioning yourself, understanding your own context that is shaping your choices. A very important part here is actually who is financing our work. I have seen during this conference, and that made me a bit sad, very few presentations that actually were explicit about who is funding their research. But of course, there are also values that come with funded. Not all research questions that should be asked are asked. So for me, it's super important. And I think our paper demonstrates that you can very analytical, yet having an explicit normative stance while doing that. And the other point, we're coming quickly back to what Connie, you started with the performance question, is this both ways is very interesting to me, because did you suggest that basically performance becomes difficult to analyze if more voices are heard about what could be performance?
Well, I mean, one way, okay, a simple way to put it might be, well, what, a question of where should decisions be made, or whether whether you use a metric of equity or effectiveness or whatever else you like. I mean, in a sense, we're presuming that, if we say, what is the performance of international forest governance, that what should happen, or what we're measuring performance by is whether what has been decided at international level is being dutifully implemented at a local level, whereas, is there room in that? And then what would that mean for research to think, well, maybe this, this normative, or international will, this normative set of standards and rules, may appropriately be modified or changed, possibly beyond recognition at a local level. Because I think this is one of the great tensions that we're facing in this whole idea of trying to mix ideas about decolonizing with ideas about global governance in a very unequal world, I guess you could say. So I just I think it raises this whole idea of performance, raises a very interesting idea of, questions again about, performance of what and for whom and who gets to decide. So, it has to do with, I mean, obviously, many people feel there's need for collective action at an international level. But what is the right balance? Sorry, yeah, Lucas.
Yes, if I may. So I guess, and well, I should not say I fear, but I think it's part of the truth that we will not solve fundamental ontological questions now. But I think with what Bas proposed with his performance terminology, also got me out of my comfort zone a little bit and provoked me out, where I would then more rationalistically be stuck with regime effectiveness or broader consequences terminologies. And I think, Bas, this is what you and your research program are trying to do, is to highlight some of the things that are happening, so some causalities, some effects, or call it what we wish, that happen. And I think the literature, the regime literature at least, remained a little bit constrained on intended effects, on those things that were formulated in the policies, if they formulate evaluation schemes based on what the policies themselves claim to do or not to do, to achieve and not to achieve. And this is maybe where you take this analytical scholarship further, to be aware of more informal, I would call it, unintended, unwritten down informal consequences. And this is maybe also where I would tie in Maria's plea for radicalism. Well, I would not go for normative radicalism, but for methodological radicalism. So we need to be brave enough to come up with methodologies of how to measure what Bas proposes under performance, this broad concept.
Thank you. And I noticed there's been some, we could, this is definitely a longer conversation, and really welcome questions from our audience about this. And also just to follow up on a few things that have shown up in the chat. One is a request if Bas and Maria might like to share their presentations in the chat, because as Lucas did, that would be great. Let me see, I think there were a few comments here. So,
but Connie, just to facilitate that, the technicalities of sharing this goes in the chat. At the bottom right, you see a piece of paper somehow, and there you can upload from your computer some files. So maybe if you don't find the technicalities, or Agatha can put it in the chat.
Yeah, or maybe, someone can do that for us. Okay, that would be great. And so there's a comment here about from Norbert Weber. Would you like to speak? I'll wait. Can we see if he would like to speak, or I could read it out?
Maybe Norbert, just open the microphone if you can.
I fear they have to invite him as speaker.
Could we invite Norbert Weber? Well, I guess meanwhile I can read it out if he, here we go. Okay.
Does it work now?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just inspired by this menu metaphor of Lucas by thinking about differences between international forest policy and European Union forest policy. This was just something because the share of obligatory elements is much higher. So what you should eat, what you have to eat. And so I thought it's more a prescribed diet than something you can choose, because there are so many strategies, so many regulations, so many things that have to be implemented by national actors and subnational actors. So it was just highlighting the differences between the levels of policy making. Thank you.
Thanks. Any comments from the panel on that?
Yes, I like this prescribed diet from a menu to choose from. I like this metaphor, but this also entails a lot of decisions that had been taken by those who had been in power on what is available to eat and what then you ought to eat. So yes, this resonates very well with me.
Great. So I see a comment here about most questions are on the question and answer part. Am I missing a series of questions than what I see in this chat?
Well, I think in the control panel, it has a Q&A button, or F&A, if you have the German version.
Oh,
and
gosh.
it has Yes,
Okay, I'm
I
very
also
sorry.
just
I was wondering why we weren't getting more. Okay, good. We've got lots to get through here. So next we have Vilas. Would you like to speak? Maybe given that we now have quite a few on here, I might just go through and read some of them. We can discuss those and then take it from there. Because yeah, let's see. So here's a comment. Oh, okay, you're on. So go for it.
I think it's fine. We can just re-select that questions, otherwise it will take too much time. So.
Okay, sure. So it says, very interesting to see these very different opposing question mark evaluation of the degree of success of the global regime. What are the main reasons? Scientific prejudice, different methodologies of evaluation, or else? So I think what I'll do is I'll read a few questions and then maybe the panelists can speak to what speaks to them. Yeah, so I mean, and how much disagreement was there between panelists? Okay, so then we have from Katrine Bowling, Dubas Art's Global Local Nexus Framework and Lucas Gieson's Two Faces of International Governance ultimately lead to different findings in empirical research. So that's a similar kind of question. Laura Seiko, Boss, very interesting approach to try to give a sense of the local context. Regarding the pending issue of appropriate counterfactual, there should be a comparison of the positive impacts identified in countries where the 4 global forest governance initiatives have been applied with the changes on the same aspects observed, this is rather long, registered in countries where they have not been implemented. Thus, the need to scale down how the global regimes have been transformed into the national. And there are many other disturbing factors: culture, investments, allocation, socioeconomic conditions. Thus, is the counterfactual impossible? And if yes, how can we really provide evidence of the policy and governance impacts? Okay, so that's, and then let's take one more. To add to the first questions, how do epistemological and ontological perspectives feed into these different observations? I think we've been talking about that to some extent. So that's from Micah Stelter. Actually, all of these have a similar theme to them. So maybe quick comments from the panel. Yeah, Bas.
Yeah, I can say a few words about those questions. First of all, thank you, audience, for posing those. Yes, we do have, I think, different findings to share with you. And indeed, these are related to different ontologies, epistemology, theories, methods, data, but also the interpretation of data. And this is just how it is. Some people would see that as weakness. I see it as a strength because it's a pluralism in science. And if you combine them, of course, these might diverge, but then you can have a discussion where you might converge. But sometimes also findings do converge from different perspectives and different epistemologies. And then you even have a stronger evidence, more robust evidence if you have similar kind of findings from different perspectives. So I think that that's very strong. And you also learn from different perspectives, because I learned from Lucas and his and the fact that he brings politics in and power, and I'm realizing, okay, maybe that's the weaker part of my framework on the global local nexus. And Maria and her call for positionality and decolonizing, and then I think, okay, yes, I'm a European scientist with my own perspective, and that has an impact on how you do research. And of course, I tried to be open on that, transparent, but still maybe not sufficient open. So these are all things which are positive to these different approaches. Then maybe shortly about counterfactual. So at a local level, and that's the systematic literature review, you look at all kind of impact assessments from the literature. Often you start with 1,000 papers, and you look at those who indeed use counterfactuals at the local level to try to establish impacts from a certain intervention and compare that with a non-intervention counterfactual. And those studies, and these can even be qualitative, it's not necessarily a trial or a semi-experiment in the field, but can also be a comparative case study. And those studies you take into consideration in your systematic review. So there's always at a local level a counterfactual, but I meant a counterfactual will, if you compare the local with the global, whether the global really co-shapes impacts on the ground. Yeah, and with the positive and the negative, and the benefits and the non-benefit, I don't see a big issue about that, because I agree with Maria that science can be normative, can be part of thinking about transformational change and these kind of issues, but you have to be transparent on it, and you have at the same time trying to build findings and evidence, but also be transparent on that, and that complex together brings you to certain findings and interpretations.
Thanks, Bas. Lucas, you had your hand up.
Yes, and I'm very positively surprised by and I'm very happy for those very intriguing questions and taking us really steps further and making ourselves reflect on our own approaches. Nevertheless, we only have our own approaches in the first place, right? And from there can develop further. And I'm seeing Bas now really taking big steps. The way he took on my comments on his book publication, this was impressive. And I'm trying my best to do the same, but coming from different perspectives, analytical perspectives. I think Bas and I, in essence, don't arrive at so different findings. And I think it was in 2016, Bas, when we found in Bogor, in both our presentations, that we both have this multi-level aspect of global to something happening towards local. And we come to relatively similar findings using different terminology, looking from different perspectives. And this, I think, is, as Bas says, even supporting from in a logic of triangulation, even theory triangulation, researcher triangulation, ontological triangulation, using different data, different cases, but coming to very similar findings. And then, yes, I think the interpretations and the conclusions we draw might be different depending on our, and now I take Georg's comment in the chat series, or our own normative orientations. My normativism might be trying to be as analytical as possible, and others might be different, or might take this in other directions. And I will leave it here because I'm seeing Maria also needs to jump in here.
Yes, even though, thanks so much. Thanks also so much for these really interesting comments in the and questions and pointers actually in the chat. I keep smiling here because, of course, with my epistemology and ontology at play, I really struggle with this idea that anyone here would be not normative. Of course, we have beliefs, we have values. I'm very sorry, but as a researcher, I guess analysis is a practice, but of course we have to start the whole thing by being aware and being explicit, transparent about the values, the beliefs that drive our research. And when we talk about forest governance and global forest governance, then I think a very important part of the self-reflection of where we are with our beliefs and values, and a very good start would be to really ask the question for whom I'm doing this research. So who benefits from my research, but also for whom I'm doing that? What drives me? What's my motivation? Of course, yeah, but I could go on and on there, but I really have, I do struggle by a claim that says I distinguish and I'm analytical here. And that's it. I think we are all analytical, otherwise we wouldn't be here. That's very important. And then the question is, we might have very different values or beliefs, even though I doubt that actually, but that might be the case. I have one other issue here on my paper where I wanted to say something to, and that's Laura Secco. You made this the points about the counterfactual, And I'm all the time looking at Connie because I remember long discussions that we had about, is the counterfactual actually the gold standard when it comes to evaluation or to performance assessments, however then you approach this. But I think we had a very long discussion, and I do think establishing counterfactuals comes with all the challenges that Laura, you pointed out already in your comment here. And I guess Bas already highlighted some of these challenges also in your talk, and maybe then in your book, which I haven't yet read, which I will do. But I think there is much more to that. It's this assumption of, can you even, the big question, can you even establish a counterfactual in all of that? We tried to do this in the global comparative study on RED+, where we tried with a before and after control intervention design to analyze the performance. And I think there are many challenges related to that, but it's still interesting of trying to do that. It's a useful exercise. It might not be the gold standard, but I still think it's worth the effort of at least analytically trying to design such an approach. But I'm looking forward to more discussions on this topic, because obviously, seeing also the excitement here in the chat, there is so much to talk about when it comes to not only performance, but also to assessing performance of global forest governance.
Thanks, Maria. And I would also add to that, but just very, very quickly, I mean, are there particular types of questions that might lend themselves better to this concept of a counterfactual than others? You know, if we're talking about a one singular intervention, then maybe perhaps it's might be easier to apply, for example, than a very complex and intervention that itself is so diversified that it might be hard to really tease out, before and after a cause and effect, et cetera. But anyway, so we have another comment. I'll try to summarize because a lot of really interesting points, and they're quite long, some of them. So from Micah Stelter, it basically is a question to Lucas about, does the international even matter at the domestic level? And what does this tell us about the way these international agreements are formulated or how they work? I think something to that extent. And is this really a customization, or is it a possibility that domestic actors are just taking these initiatives to legitimize what they're doing already? I think that also speaks to some extent to what Maria said. Then we have a very interesting metaphorical question from Georg Mingel to Bas, who is Chloris and Hydra in this panel, and what to do with Lucas. Okay, so I leave you to interpret that. Okay, at least it's short and very poetic. Okay, so, and then Laura again. Lucas, thanks for the two interesting perspectives. You might have stated it, but I missed the point. I wonder if you consider the term international synonymous with global in your research. Shouldn't we differentiate them? Yes, and then finally, let's see one more here. Todora Rogeja, Bas and Lucas, could you reflect on different kinds of power that characterize international forestry regimes and nexuses, different kinds of power? So yeah, maybe some relatively brief responses from the panel.
I will start before Bas has to sort me into Chloris or Hydra. Sorry to go first, Bas, yeah. But I think does international matter at all? Or is it just national actors using something to legitimize? I think based on our research, and I think this resonates with a lot of other on EU integration research and other international relations research, I think the picture is a little bit more nuanced. International, since the 1990s, globalization, these things, or after World War II with ICT, international regimes and so forth, I think we are observing yet another tier or a scale of governance with international. And let me say right away, our conceptualization of international is global, regional, plus bilateral. So we are not setting it equal, but the one is a set and the others are subsets of this international set. So this additional tier of governance layer provides actors worldwide with new ways of engaging with international institutions, rules and norms, but also actors surrounding them. So in this logic of multi-level governance from Hoch and Marx, Gary Marx and Lisbeth, I think, Hoch, this multi-level game simply provides additional opportunities and avenues for coalitions among actors, and drawing on arguments, drawing on discourses, but also drawing on physical and financial resources and political actor support. So this is also how I would answer this power question of the regimes. It very much depends on how much money runs under which regime, which actor feeds a certain regime. Is it the World Trade Organization, or is it NATO, or who feeds that, and how much is fed into in terms of financing, in terms of norms, but also in terms of discourses of saying what is good and what is bad. Yeah, Russia is bad and NATO is good, and these type of setting norms, I think there Bas and colleagues also made a big contribution of how discourses can shape and pave the way for then more hardcore elements of power sources to appear in regimes. And I'll leave it here.
Great, thanks. Maybe just quick responses. We still have some more to get through on the comments, but Bas, did you have anything to say to Georg, among other things? We're all curious what.
Yeah. Well, he refers to the title of my book from last October, which is called Forest Governance, Hydra or Chloris. And Hydra, yeah, both are figures from Greek mythology, and Chloris is the goddess of the flowers. This is more of a let's say optimistic image of governance, and Hydra is the multi-headed serpent, which if you try to fight it, it becomes even stronger. This is a very short summary. And it's often used in management literature to show that a solution for a problem creates another problem. So the Hydra is more the analysis that shows that many of these initiatives to fight deforestation simply fail or even worsen the situation. And the Hydra metaphor, for example, says, well, we do see some flowers blooming at the same time. So that's more the, well, I think with my story, I emphasize more the Chloris perspective, maybe Maria more the Hydra perspective. But in the end, I also say that both are real, so to speak, that you do find maybe islands of some progress, but at the same time we have these hotspots of deforestation, of exploitation, etc., etc. So therefore, I think Georg asked me, yeah, and where to locate Lucas. I think it's simply impossible to locate Lucas somewhere, or so I leave it to that. And then about these different kinds of power, following this global local network perspective, power is implied in all these elements which are identified there. So discursive, normative in the rules, and also in the resources, and particularly the distribution of resources. That's my short and simple answer.
Great. If we have no more really pressing responses to that, I think a lot of related following comments, Maria too. So we are going to look forward to more comments from you as we move forward. I see a really excellent and interesting question from Timu Haryanki. And it says, thank you for very inspiring talks. My question is, should researchers coordinate their research efforts or topics more in cooperation globally, since our resources are limited, but we are facing huge issues? Should or could there be some kind of a forum for coordinating research and finding research partners? So that's, I guess, to all of us. Interesting thought. Laura thanks Maria for her proposal, which she fully supports, that there's no time to be neutral or politically correct if this is even possible. That's just my little aside there. That's something we're debating. But anyway, as scientists, I think we need to take a position, being normative and trying to find robust science-based evidence to influence decisions in the direction we think is more ethical for forests. That's from Laura. And then Benjamin Posher, a short question related to the normative values or preferences of society, and ultimately science and researchers. What is your opinion on environmental education, including youth as a long-term change of normatives and as, I guess, long-term change agents for society? And then let's do one more. Wenyan Liang, question to Lucas, two faces of governance. Does it implicate a lack of robust global sovereign body? So a lack of a strong sovereign authority to guarantee the rule of law at the international level? So this sounds like an argument for a very centralized, powerful global body to navigate all of this. So yeah, I hope you all might have a quick response to those questions, any or all questions.
Maybe can I start also a little bit to reply to what Bas in response to Georg's question was pointing, this hydra chloris. And I do struggle with this a little bit, and again, I do understand where you are coming from with this, but I really don't think it's a problem of being pessimistic or optimistic. It's a question of being realistic, and it's a question of being willing to understand problematizations rather than, sometimes I believe we are a bit obsessed these days with this focus on finding solutions, providing solutions, finding flowers, finding the good story, the selling story. And maybe what we need, and that is why I came up with this radical call, is this is not about depression, this is not about this kind of hydra attitude, but it's really about a realistic assessment of what works, what doesn't work, when does it work, but most importantly, for whom does all of this work? This question for whom keeps getting lost also in our conversation, and performance for whom, benefits for whom, and for whom do we do these assessments? But coming back to this hydra and chloris, I really think everybody loves to solve something, but have we even understood not just problems, but also who is problematizing what, and who is problematized in global forest governance? If you look at the colonial literature, and if I look at today's colonial forest science literature, and today, let's say the REDD+ action plan for DRC, not much has really changed. What is problematized is always, and also then the solutions. Esther Turnhout and Margarete Skutsch wrote a wonderful paper about that. Who is problematized, and then who is the solution barrier? Is the problem really to provide $2 more for a smallholder somewhere in the world, or do we then have to spend all our time on that, or is this local level sometimes a distraction from problems that are lying somewhere else? I'm going too far here, but this hydra chloris thing is kind of making me edgy, because I think it's distracting from the issues. And looking for what is good is maybe, and that comes back to Bas, in your talk, you mentioned you were actually surprised that you had 50% success stories. And I was smiling then. I was thinking there's this paper by Malka Mekki et al. They did a systematic review of the impact of large-scale tree plantations, and what was reported that was less positive, perhaps. I'm sure that featured in your review as well as an impact assessment when it comes to global forest governance, or maybe it didn't because it's tree plantations, but maybe it should, because that's what global forest governance is very much about. Long story short, I think 50% happy findings, 50% less happy findings might be also a question again of what were we looking for, what was measured, and by whom, for what purpose. As Laura Secco here in this chat wrote, we all have to provide, it seems that's the new narrative, provide these nice stories, provide a pretend perhaps that you provide a counterfactual, and your research will be funded. I'm going far too far here. I'm sorry, but this is inspiring and I get too many questions. But Bas, back to
Yeah,
you.
can I
Sure.
respond to a few things? Well, I summarized this hydrochlorous too quickly because but you didn't see it, but it has different layers. It also has an analytical layer, and there it's comparing problem-solving theory on the one hand and critical theory on the other. So that's also part of this. But yes, I thought it was attractive to use metaphors, but at the same time, it has a danger in it that it's simplifying. So that's the first thing. On the other hand, I tend to disagree that we are so much focused on finding successes or positive stories, because if I follow social media, it's so negative about forest issues. So I tend to disagree. And also in the scholarly literature, there's a lot of, and which is fine. There needs to be critical theory. So both sides needs to be addressed, and even better, you also need to find for a kind of third way and a synthesis. And I also try to do that, to go beyond this simplistic hydrochlorous thing. But yeah, at the same time, of course, we need to be critical to these kind of impact assessments and the benchmark they set and the counterfactual and et cetera, and also include other kind of stories and evaluations or whatever you would like to call them. So it's not my intention to say this is the only good way of evaluating. No, it's one way of doing it, and it brings some findings to the foreground, while at the same time, of course, we need to remember that this is just part of the story.
Great, thank you. Well, we're coming very close to the end here. Yes, Lucas, you wanted to make probably it's going to be close to a final intervention at this point.
I don't know if it should be final.
Okay.
I don't want to make final things here. Yeah, but I see that many people here in the chat appreciate this discussion. So the organizers might indicate if we can extend a minute or two.
Yeah, it would be nice if people have time, because there's more excellent points here. A lot of them on the theme of, you know, who has authority or who should have authority to make decisions or even define performance in international forest governance. There's questions about whether scientists can be non-normative. That's Georg.
Yes, I would, but Connie, I would like to jump on two questions that you posed. First is this lack of sovereignty body in international governance. Well, I would not say a lack. It is not there. Analytically speaking, it is not there. If I'm saying there is a lack, I somehow imply a desire. It would be nice too. I don't have a solution to this, and I'm not offering a solution. I'm also not saying I'm not normative. I'm saying I'm trying to do my work as analytical as possible. And I want to put this into perspective. And this addresses these questions of science as change agents, and should not we as scientists. There are some scientists with ontologies who do, there are some others who don't, there are some who do this and some who do that. And I would not challenge this. There I would follow Bas' recommendation of let 1,000 blossoms bloom. But I recall that in the 13th century medieval Europe, among all these small kings and dukes, all these small kings and dukes wanted to be the first ones with their alchemists, with their scientists, to synthesize gold. And they said to the alchemists, please mix me gold. Until some years later, maybe even some centuries later, someone told them, or someone found, gold is an element not to be synthesized, full stop. I'm not talking social sciences so far, yeah, but this is my direction. So I see my mandate in first providing as pure as possible knowledge. Yes, on questions that I'm asking. Yes, that questions that my funder would like me to ask. And sticking with DFG, at least in German conditions, we are relatively safe to not, work for Unilever or Nestlé or you name what you like or don't like as funding agencies. But then in a second mandate, and this is what I mean with Karl Marx. In the first place, I think we need to understand, I tell my students, we need a periodical system of human interaction, of human behavior. And once we understand this better, step by step, then we can bring this knowledge into use. And some of us want to do this, and some want to do this less to get knowledge into action. And some want to do it under certain conditions. So for me, science is also something like conditioned rationality, some sort of rationality under certain explicated and to be explicated conditions. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective on the generation of knowledge in academics and research. Georg also had a question, I guess, following a bit on this conversation about to Lucas, isn't your analytical perspective not also a normative position, expecting certain interests to exist from the start and even being most important? So to me, you only operate in different science paradigms, or is there a fundamental difference, e.g. relating to the importance given to a certain state for forests and our people? And then and in parentheses, Maria concerned Lucas. Okay, I'm not sure about that last part, but I think it is also a question around, where do norms, or do they, have a place in setting, I guess, scientific agendas, as well as how we conduct our science, and what is knowledge, and is there, and I would throw in there, might it partly depend on what you're trying to understand? Or you're trying to understand people's sense of meaning, or are you trying to understand whether a tree is still standing or not? That those are maybe different kinds of questions. So maybe call for maybe different approaches. And then there's a question here from Peter Aurenhammer to Boss. Indeed, there exists research combining top-down, bottom-up, and horizontal relations in international forest development policy. So that sounds like a comment that there is research that combines these different approaches. Todora Rogelja, Maria, what is your take on social innovation in relation to sustainability equity and the ability to have radical impacts on redistribution of power? And then from Peter Aurenhammer again to Lucas, is the role of NGOs as strong? NGOs from North, and if so, I guess NGOs from the North or South. Let me see how many, we're getting there to the questions. I'm trying to think, and I'll do another one from Georg, and then I think we can do one more round and close out. So it says, to all, what are the consequences of the different positions of the three of you for the science, policy, society interface? Coming back to Wednesday's discussion, if you're for that, do you take up different niches in the knowledge system? And what should we all conclude for managing that system? All right, so some hopefully relatively concise responses from each of you, or any or all of you, and then we can finish up with the last set of questions. Just 2 more points after that. Who would like to go? Yeah, okay.
I will pick up Georg's challenge of position analytical approach within a world full of norms and being social constructs. I subscribe to your observation. Yes, I would not say I am value free, and I would also not say this is about me. This is about a whole scientific paradigm. So let's not boil it down to this, Lucas or someone else question, but I would agree with you, yes. But what I'm trying to do is, as much as alchemists tried to, synthesize gold, and finally found out it doesn't work, trying my best to, set up my lab, if I use this natural science language, to set up my lab in a way that dust and other interfering variables don't disturb my measurements too much. I'm not saying the measurements are perfect. I'm saying my measurements are influenced by my own history, by my own, longings or things. Yes, but step by step, trying to reflect on them. And this is what I learned in FNP in Wageningen under Bas instruction, reflecting the researcher's role. But still sticking to some fundamental, and this is where we will not find agreement, and it's not necessary to do so, on our ontologies, on what is knowledgeable, what is knowable, and how is it measurable. And then to the second question that was posed in my direction, that's a more easy one. Are NGOs really so strong? I think, Peter, you are referring to my finding that in this bilateral development cooperation, also your field of expertise, a lot of development cooperation strategies nowadays tend to rely more and more on NGOs. I'm not saying they entirely do or they outcompeted state counterparts. I'm just saying they are doing this increasingly, posing big questions on capacities on state side. And if I ask myself, how did we manage in Europe getting stable forest cover, for example? It is stable state bureaucracy and not so much having Greenpeace in place since 300 years, but more or less having military corps in place since 300 years, taking care of forests. Not saying this is good, not saying this is bad.
Maria.
Yeah, just to continue, because now, Lucas, you played the perfect pass. I actually don't think it's the state system that allowed Europe to have forest cover, but I think it had a lot to do with, again, colonialism, eating resources elsewhere. And it's also not entirely accurate. If you think at the tar trade in Finland, where the big first complete deforestation took place, so it's not 300 years of continuous forest cover, but for a global commodity, which was tar, entire Finland was deforested in one moment of time, not that long ago. But another example of also colonial relationships here. So just to pick that up, but I had a question, I think there was a point by Laura, if I remember correctly, but I think we spoke about these issues already to some extent. Then there was this point that was by Tudora Rohelia from UNIPID, and she was asking about, or he was asking about, they were asking about social innovation in relation to sustainability equity. I'm not completely sure what, it's not my field, social innovation as such, and I would be happy to learn more about that, but I would argue whatever would help to really have radical impacts on redistribution of power would be very interesting to see, because as I pointed out, or tried to point out at least in my presentation, based on the work in the forest and climate change governance space in forest frontiers, what we see is that these shifts in power simply do not happen. We have sticky institutions, we have very sticky material interests, we have narratives that are sticky through centuries actually, and we also do not have, and that is where I would expect, which is not social innovation, but basically more innovation when it comes to enhancing the ability of a civil society to hold state and also the private sector accountable to their promises. So I'm looking forward to actually that and the innovation that can take place there. But perhaps there is more to say from others that are more specialized also in this field. Thank you.
Yes, I think we're getting some hints from the conference organizers that we've come past the end of our session, and there's so much. I mean, I wish we were all together in person and could carry on this conversation in the hallways and everything. This has been really fascinating, and thank you so much to everyone for your excellent presentations and discussion, and thanks to the audience for excellent questions. And let's continue this as a community into the future. So I guess, yeah, perhaps now, without further ado, thanks to everyone, and yeah, see you around.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Now I have to run too. These 5 minutes were challenging, the additional ones. See you very soon, people.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. That was really fascinating debate, if I could call it this way. I think we could indeed stay the entire day to discuss these questions. I can see that questions are coming and coming, and yeah, we could discuss it. Unfortunately, we need to wrap up because we are just starting the last point in our agenda of this conference, closing ceremony. So unfortunately, the 4th International Forest Policy meeting is over, but I hope you can stay in this group and discuss and exchange emails, exchange messages, still digest the input, all the interesting discussions, all the interesting research we learned about during the last 3 days. I would like to thank one more time all of you for being a part of this event. We enjoyed it really a lot. We are very glad and very happy that all of you were part of it. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Jeanne Ro, who have a pleasure to announce the winners of Early Career Research Competition. Please, Jeanne.
Yeah, thanks for, I would once more like to thank our participants to the competition. You guys all did a great job. I know it was really difficult to present your work in just 3 minutes. And whether you win or not today, yeah, it was great. And we encourage you to keep up your research, keep joining events like IFPM4, and keep presenting your work. And I hope that I see you all at IFPM 14 or 24, and then we can discuss over a coffee or a beer the great careers that you all made by then. Hopefully that coffee or beer will be a physical one and not a virtual one. I would then ask my colleague Matthias to go ahead, and then I will not create any more suspense, and he will announce the winners.
Yes, thank you, John, and welcome everybody also from my side to this award announcement. I think we can go directly to the next slide. So here, just as a reminder, you see again all the 9 contestants and their presentation titles that we heard on Wednesday. So as a recap, you know, all 9 contestants made a 3-minute presentation. Then in conclusion, we had an audience vote, and also we had an expert panel consisting of senior and junior level researchers at POCU and EFI, who also separately voted. Next slide, please. And also to remind you about the awards. So the top 3 will be awarded, and the award consists of a certificate and a prize, as you see mentioned here. And for the information of the top 3 winners, we are then going to contact you separately by email. Next slide, please. So, okay, before we reveal the top 3, I just want to make a couple of short observations. First one is that we noticed that the voting of the audience and of the expert panel was very much aligned and in unison with each other. So there was no big difference or disagreement noticeable there. The other observation is that the results were very close throughout. So there was no, let's say, like a landslide victory or a result for anybody. And I also want to echo what John was mentioning, that, yeah, while the top 3 only will be rewarded, but I think it's safe to say that we can, you know, consider that all 9 contestants are winners here or won here. So I think you did a really great job at a, you know, nearly impossible task of squeezing your research and delivering your message in only 3 minutes. So everybody, each contestant can pat themselves on the back for sure. So then, to first reveal our 3rd position, we can go to the next slide. So the 3rd prize goes to Elena Vissa. So congratulations to you. So her presentation was with the title Community Forestry in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a socio-economic study in the province of Chopo. Congratulations. And we can go to the 2nd position on the next slide. So this one went to Teresa Clara Loch. Congratulations, with the topic Census of Place in Welsh Community Woodland Groups. Really great. And finally, the 1st prize goes to Inna Salminen, Framing Biodiversity and Forestry in the Media. Inna actually is unfortunately not in the call right now, so she informed us informed us on Wednesday that she cannot make it to the this award announcement, so she's not here. But anyways, congrats to everybody. And I was wondering if we could briefly have Elena and Teresa turn on their video, if we could spotlight you. So we could just, yeah, great.
Hello.
So if we could have one more nice big round of applause from the audience, then we can make a nice screenshot for the annals of IFPM4. Great, that's awesome. Congrats again to everybody. Okay, superb. Okay. Yeah, then we can go to the next slide still. Yeah, so again, just thanks to all of the 9 contestants, thanks to everybody who voted, and also to Boku and EFI for sponsoring the award. And with that, we can conclude this announcement, go to the next slide, and back to John and Agata. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. One more time, congratulations to all early career researchers who participate, but especially those who were just awarded. Who knows, as John said, maybe during the IFPM 35, you will be those in the roundtable discussing the development of forest governance. Thank you very much. Okay, now really we are at the end of the conference, and I have the great pleasure just to say thank you to all of you, to our great keynotes, to Sina and Fabrizi, to journalists who join us for the session on investigative journalism, to all chairs, presenters, to all participants who ask interesting questions, to our amazing scientists, researchers during the roundtable we just had. But I also really want to thank our co-organizers. From Wageningen University and Research, we were supported by Marianne Hoekstra and Jelle Behagel and Georg Winkel. And from Boku, we were supported by Gerhard Weiss and Jarbele Elomina. I also would really like to thank our support in the room, our technical magician, we could say, Olivier and René, thank you very much. Without you, we would really not be able to organize this event. They really made magic here during the last 3 days. And now I would like to give the floor to the head of the governance program, Bernhard Boslehner, please.
Thank you, Agata. So for me, remains the pleasure to acknowledge the spirits before and behind the screen. I think it's what I followed was a hell lot of work over the past month, and finally it culminated in a, I think, smooth organization of the meeting. I didn't hear any complaints, so the feeling, as I said in my opening words, no hectics, no stress. This is always the best sign. So everybody was really cool and relaxed. So I would like to focus, because all the others have been mentioned now, on some of them who were visible, some of them who were not so visible, but many of them, all of them were really important to run this. So from the EFI team, so we have first, of course, Shan, Rina, Gabriella, Matthias, and Alex, who supported in different ways the organization of the conference. I think this was really needed, that this is a broad team effort. So this is not something that just 1 or 2 persons can do in this scale. And then, of course, we have our core team of organizers, and I would like to call them to the podium because we're close to finish. So let's make them visible here. And we have Agata, and of course, in one of her last activities in EFI. So it's also time to say farewell and also wish the best for the future. But I think it speaks for the commitment that Agata is really, until her final day, was really super active in the organization of this conference. So I think, what could it be better than just, you know, ending up space here, than ending up with such a great endeavor. So it's time for me to say thank you. Agata, you first. Thanks a lot. Just a little gift. Great success, I have to say. Then, of course, it's also Maria, so who's been running around all the time, but still with a smile. So I appreciate this, and I like this. Thanks a lot. And then, of course, our spirit. Cecilia, also big thanks to you. I think it shows also, as was mentioned earlier, it's not only the IFI team, but this sort of cooperation also with BOKU. But what makes it a success in the end is also the active participation of all of you, the audience. And I think this is the spirit we have to move further also to the next IFPM, which will then be discussed in the following meeting. So let me thank you again. Have a good rest of the weekend, a good weekend, and we will meet each other soon. And with this, I hand over. It's not entirely finished, so
it's not the end.
I got this still there.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Bernhard. I really would like to one more time emphasize that it was team effort, and it was my great pleasure to work with this dream team. It would not be possible to organize this conference without these great colleagues here. So one more time, thank you to all of you. You are really, really amazing. And I'm just so happy that I could work with you until my last day at EFI. I also forgot actually to thank our donor, because as you know, this conference was free of fee, if I could say like this, thanks to the support from the NUGO project that is funded by BMEL, German Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And now it's still not the end, because we have one more announcement, but I promise this is really the last one. It is an announcement about the next IFPM meeting, IFPM4, which will take place in Finland. So it's not anymore a secret, and we can already see Maria on the screen, who will be the next organizer. And I have a great pleasure now to give the floor to Maria, who will tell you a few words about the next organizer, and maybe she can even share something with you. Please, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agatha, and everybody for a wonderful conference. And I have nothing actually to say except that we do have already a web page live, which I just put into the chat. So if you want to go there, more announcements will follow on that web page also. And we are just looking forward to have you all in 2 years. I really do hope that in 2 years' time, there might be a chance of something I believe you guys in EFI as the last organizers were now really suffering under, and that is that there was no personal interaction really. I do hope we will have that in Helsinki then in 2 years. And I'm very happy also together with my colleagues, Irmeli Mustalahati from UEA and also Helga Pülse from EFI and UN. So I had already some initial discussions, and we will continue to work on the format of the page. Don't forget that in half an hour, for those of you interested, I know it's a lot to ask, but for those of you interested, we do a little reflection exercise, as you might have seen in the program later after the official closing. And if you have any inputs you would like to share and maybe help to shape also the Helsinki IFPM meeting number 5, then please come to that session and join us there. I could share the screen, but I don't think, I think I gave all of you now the link. So if you, and nothing is happening on that web page, I'm just so proud that we have one, which is why I wanted to share it. So yeah, seeing you all in 2 years' time then for IFPM4, and I hope we can at least follow up on this exciting and really inspiring discussions that we had already here now in this in the current IFPM4 meeting. Thank you, Agatha, and thank you again for all the work you did for bringing us together. Sure.
Thank you very much, Maria. We are really, really looking forward to meet you all in 2 years in Helsinki. So that's our plan. Please keep this date already in your calendars. So it's booked for IFPM4. And as Maria said, for all of you who are interested in the future of IFPM, we meet in a little bit more than half an hour at 1:30 in the informal setting to discuss the future of IFPM. And then that's all from our end. IFPM4, it's officially closed. Thank you all, and see you hopefully in 30 minutes and then in 2 years in Helsinki. Bye. Thank you all.